Winifred Aldridge, page 87. What I'm calling shoulder seam. She calls this the bust dart into seams. So can you see the working drawing there? It's got a seam coming down from the shoulder right to the waist. So I have an example here. This garment here has a seam, shoulder seam coming right down, okay, from shoulder to waistline. What we're doing essentially, you can see the flat drawings, you can see the panel lines on the front and the back. Notice there's an opening down the back, so when we get to our final pattern piece, we know that the opening is at the back, and that will help us decide where we put our seam allowance. So there's panel lines. You can also see down the center front, there is no seam down the center front. So our final pattern piece, we won't be putting seam allowance there. There's no seam down the center front. Then we're looking here. This here is our first construction. It's this. Now she has it represented just from the waist up. We're going to do all the way down because it's just a little bit more learning, I suppose. And you can see her pattern pieces. So here's our construction and here's our pattern pieces. There is no second construction in this case. We're going to do very little on this, and it's all about the tracing off. So the bust dart into seams with close waist shaping. So that means it's close to the waist. It's not boxy. The body section, trace around the bodice block required. So reminding us that we can put any block down here. It could be a coat, it could be a jacket, it could be menswear. So that's how she refers to that. Draw in close waist shaping. That's this. We've actually already done that. This is why sometimes I need to interpret these things. Then draw a line from the back shoulder dart to the top of the waist dart. So could people understand what that is? Draw a line from the back shoulder dart. Here's our back. Here's our shoulder dart. We're going to draw a line from there to the top of the waist dart. And you can see she has it drawn on the picture there. All right? So when you're following her instructions, some of them aren't that hard. I think most people would be able to follow this. It is slightly curved, but all your lines should be using a ruler, or if it's slightly curved, you might need to sort of sketch it, but just be sure it's nice and straight. Then she says, transfer the bust dart to the center shoulder. Now ours is already in the center shoulder, so we don't need to do that step. But if we started with a different block, she's basically letting you know that you would need to manipulate the dart into the center shoulder position. Draw the front seam line through the bust dart position to the top of the waist dart. That's already done. They're like basically that one to that one, so they're connected. And then her next instruction says cut out the panel sections and trace around. So whenever Winifred says cut, we will trace and then cut, because we're not going to cut our first construction. And then the panel seam and side seams can be curved to create good lines. So do you see on her drawing there, just look closely, see the way she has dotted lines and then a solid line. So the dotted lines are always the starting point, and her solid lines are what she has changed it to. So when you're looking at that, you're learning how to interpret what she's saying and what she's doing. So essentially, these lines are very straight and the body is not very straight. So this kind of line of going in and a dart to a point and then coming out, the body does not do that. The body curves. But it's much easier to manipulate our patterns and to start with straight lines. And we do all of our adjustments and then we curve in at the end. So that is what I would consider an advancement on the drafting. Good patterns, well-made patterns will curve everything off so it fits the body in a more smooth, nicer fashion. And then the only other thing we're going to do, which isn't included on this, is because we have a full underneath section that's below the waist. Hers is from here up. We're just going to extend that line here, a line straight down from the bottom of that dart. So if I want to go draw a line, the way Winifred would say it, or the way I would say it, is drop a line from the dart. What that means is you're drawing a line from the tip or the apex. Remember we had that term, the apex of the dart is the tip of the dart, and we're going to go straight down. That means, I won't say it, but it means be parallel to that center front line. So if I come over here, the way I'm going to draw this line, I'm going to come over, and if that's 10, I'm going to measure 10 again, and then I'm going to come in a straight line down. Okay, and now I'm going to drop a line from the bottom of this dart. So I'm going to measure over, find what that measurement is. And they're the only things that we do on this construction, because the thing that we're going to do next is take these sections apart, and we learn how to have this section be separate to this, because there's a seam, they're sewn together. And so we need to create different pattern pieces that we put on fabric and cut out and sew together. So this here, this piece needs to be separate to this piece. So I need to put my paper down, trace around this, and then move my paper over and then trace around this other section. One important thing is our straight of grain. So on this panel we're going to have a straight of grain because we have our center back line, but on this one we don't. So we're going to put in a straight of grain line. So the straight of grain, remember, identifies the grain line of the fabric going a very particular way. It's very important that garments don't sit well unless they're on grain. So we need to measure over and create a parallel line to our center back line. It doesn't matter what the measurement is. I can come over 12. If I come over 12, 12, 12, that's fine. But I could also come over, for me, 20, 20, 20, and I could have a line, just as long as it's parallel. Now I'm going to put it slightly over to the side because I know my labeling needs to fit in there, and if I put it right down the middle, my labeling has to go right through the line. So it's just from experience, I try and put it over to one side. So you measure over an amount and put a grain line, which is a line parallel to your center back and front in there. So I'm going to do that here, and I'm going to do it from the front as well. I'm going to come in an amount. Doesn't have to be the same as the one on the other side. There you go. There's our first construction complete. We have created panels, and now we need to trace them off as separate pieces. When we do this, there's lots of different ways. You can use highlighter on yours. That's what I would recommend. Little dots of green highlighter all the way around this one. And then maybe pink highlighter all the way along this one. And then blue or whatever. And then yellow or something. So that you can pick them out as separate pieces. Now I can't really use highlighter on the board. So another system that you can use if you don't have a highlighter is symbols. So I can draw little triangles around this. All the lines that I'm tracing off. Now, how do you pick out the lines you're tracing off? You do have to concentrate. It's hard to know which line sometimes that you're tracing off. But remember, the dart is a missing bit of fabric, or and remember, this is the waist, and we're going in at the waist. So if you're trying to kind of take this abstract shape and make sense of it, which line do I trace off? It's like, okay, well, what part of the body? Oh, it's the female form and its waist, it's going in. So we go in on the line and we look at our piece. It's going narrower at the waist. We know we're correct. That's the correct line. And then it's going back out towards the hip. That's the correct line. So that might help you because it's very easy to just pick out the wrong line. The next shape, I could do circles here. So some of the lines will have two symbols on them because they're being traced off for this side, and then the same line is being used for the other side.
Could you draw a line?
So a little word of advice, try and get in the habit of trace and then move your piece of paper, trace and then move your piece of paper, so you have enough room for your seam allowance. It's really easy to forget to do that. While I trace off, I've traced off along all the correct lines that I've marked, and I've traced in my straight of grain. Straight of grain always has arrows at the end of it, each end. That's what defines it as different to any other line, and I put an S on it. Winifred does not put the S. So now I've traced that, and I'm going to move it over. I'm going to do my labeling after. I'm just going to trace. Move it over so there's plenty of space for seam allowance, and now I'm tracing the second one. This piece looks like this. I'm coming down the left side of this dart. It's now just one side of mine. So that's this center back panel. Notice the lines here, which are the notches. They would be vital because this piece would have to sew to this piece. And when it's fabric, this could be all moving around in funny ways, and we might not know what we're sewing to what. And so these are like the jigsaw pieces. It's like this sews to this sews to that, this sews to that. Also notice, do you see the way this piece goes a funny shape? But actually it looks straight on the body, doesn't it? Yeah. So when you're starting, a lot of time people feel like drawing a straight line on your paper should be a straight line on the body, but it's not the way it is. If you want a straight line on the female form here along this section, it will look like that in 2 dimensions. Now, because this is my center back line, I have a grain line in here. And now I have a grain line in there. So my 2 back panels are traced. I need to put my labeling in, but for the moment I'm just going to trace the 2 front panels, and then we can put our labels in. Okay, so step 1 of a construction, and then here is step 2. Well, actually here is our pattern pieces that have been traced off. So that's what they look like. And then from the back, here is our pattern pieces traced off our construction. We only have 1 step to the construction. The next thing is to label, put the labeling and the seam allowance on, and the hem allowance. So I'm going to do it on one for the example for you, and then I'll go around and just check with everyone, but you'll need to do the same on all the other ones. Just I might not get to example all of it. So for you guys, the seam allowance is 0.5, remember, but I'm using 1.5. Also, it's maybe good to look and see how I'm putting the seam allowance on using this the gauges there. We'll do 2 centimeters because in full scale it would be 4. And remember our fishtailing concept. So once we're on a hem, we need to fishtail. So it's only very slight, but this is going out a little bit. So we need to flip that up one is squared, so it will come the same. But this one's going to come in slightly. I can see it there. So that is my fish-tailed. Then find a spot on it to do your labeling with your name. You can write your initials. I'm going to call this shoulder seam. So the garment is a shoulder seam garment. We can just call it shoulder seam for short. The tricky bit for this draft is this third line down. Our third line on our labeling, which is here, which is the name of the pattern piece. So this is the back, but there's two parts to the back. There's this panel and this panel, so we need to label it correctly. This one I would probably call the center back panel, and this the side back. It gets more difficult if there's more panels. Two is kind of okay. You have a center one and you have a side one. So I'm going to call this side back panel. And then how many are we cutting? Yeah, this one isn't zipped up. But two, we're going to have two side panels. Side back panel here, side back panel there. We're also going to have two center back panels because like this one, the opening is in the back. So they'll all be cut to except for the center front panel because that's going to be put on the fold. There's no seam down the center front line there. Okay, so your final pattern pieces, all four of them should look like this with their labeling, their seam allowance then cut out.